Richard Walker, the CEO of one of the biggest fast food chains in the country, walked into his own restaurant, expecting a normal day. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he blended in as just another customer, an ordinary man craving a burger. He had built Walker's Burgers from the ground up, believing that good food and great service made all the difference. But lately, whispers had reached him, complaints of mistreated employees, unhappy staff, and poor management in some locations. So he decided to go undercover, to see it for himself. As he stepped up to the counter and placed his order, everything seemed normal. The grill sizzled, customers chatted, the cash register beeped. But just as he reached for his wallet, he heard something that made his stomach drop. Soft, muffled sobs. The cashier, a young woman, was crying. And at that moment, Richard knew something was terribly wrong. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. Because what happens next? You won't believe it. Richard Walker stood frozen at the counter, his fingers gripping his wallet as the sound of muffled sobs reached his ears. It was so faint that most customers didn't seem to notice. But he did. He subtly glanced at the young woman behind the register. She had her head slightly bowed, her fingers trembling as she tried to type in his order. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she repeated, "Would you like fries with that?" Richard's sharp instincts, honed from decades of running a business, told him something was off. Employees weren't supposed to be breaking down in the middle of their shift. He observed the restaurant, not just as a customer, but as a leader. Richard wasn't just another billionaire sitting in a corporate office, disconnected from reality. He had started this company from the bottom. Decades ago, he was the one behind the counter flipping burgers and cleaning floors. He worked long hours, barely making ends meet before opening his first burger joint. Slowly, he turned it into a multi-million-dollar empire. But one thing he always believed in: treating employees with respect. That's why he was here. Lately, he'd been hearing complaints. Some locations were reporting high employee turnover, poor morale, and even workplace mistreatment. Instead of relying on reports, he wanted to see the truth for himself. But what he didn't expect was to find one of his cashiers crying while taking orders. Emma, the cashier, was only 22 years old. But life had already been cruel to her. A single mother, working double shifts to provide for her 3-year-old son, struggling financially, barely affording rent while also paying for daycare. Overworked and exhausted, but afraid to lose her job. Today had been especially rough. She had arrived at work late because her babysitter canceled last minute. She had barely eaten, and worst of all, her manager had humiliated her in front of the staff earlier. "You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot," he had hissed. "If you don't get your act together, you can forget about your next paycheck." So now, here she was, fighting back tears while taking orders. She wasn't weak, she was just exhausted. But what she didn't realize, the man standing in front of her wasn't just another customer. He was the owner. Carl, the store manager, had been working at Walker's Burgers for 8 years. But unlike Richard, he didn't care about people, he cared about power. He ruled through intimidation, not leadership. Employees feared him, knowing he cut hours if they made even the smallest mistake. He especially targeted the weakest, like Emma. To him, kindness was a weakness. So when he saw Emma wiping away tears while working, he didn't feel sympathy. He felt annoyance. And that's when Richard watched him march over, his eyes burning with impatience. Richard had designed Walker's Burgers to be more than just another fast food chain. It was supposed to be a place where employees were valued, where customers felt welcome. But as he stood in this location, he saw something different. Employees working in silence, afraid to make mistakes. A manager who carried himself with arrogance, not leadership. A young woman, barely holding it together, terrified of losing her job. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. And as Carl stepped up to Emma, his voice already sharp with frustration, Richard knew one thing. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was about to step in. Richard remained still, watching as Carl approached the counter. His sharp business instincts told him this was a moment that would reveal everything about how this store was run. Emma, still wiping her eyes, tensed when she saw her manager. She quickly forced a smile, trying to compose herself as she handed Richard his receipt. But Carl wasn't interested in the customers. He was focused on her. "Are you serious right now?" Carl muttered, his voice low but sharp. Emma froze, her fingers tightening around the register. "You think customers want to see a cashier crying? Do you know how embarrassing this looks?" Richard's grip on his wallet tightened. Embarrassing. This man wasn't concerned about her well-being. He was worried about appearances. Emma quickly shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." Carl snorted. "Yeah, you're always sorry, but you're also always screwing up. You were late today, weren't you?" Emma opened her mouth, hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but—" "No excuses," Carl interrupted. "I don't care if you were late because of your kid or because the world was ending. If you can't handle this job, there are plenty of other people who need it." Richard felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. This wasn't discipline. This was humiliation. And worst of all, it was happening in front of customers. Richard glanced around. Other employees were watching but too afraid to intervene. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen. But Richard, he was done pretending. "Excuse me," Richard finally spoke, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Carl barely glanced at him. "Sir, I'll be with you in a moment." Richard didn't move. Neither did his gaze. "No," he said. "You'll deal with this right now." Emma's eyes widened as she looked at the man who had just ordered a burger, the customer she thought was just a stranger. Carl let out a sigh of annoyance, finally turning to face him. "Look, sir, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "That's the problem," Richard interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "You don't know who I am." Carl blinked. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Richard placed his burger order on the counter. He didn't care about food anymore. "Is this how you run my store?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. Carl frowned. "Your store? What are you talking about?" Richard pulled out his company ID, the one that said Richard Walker, CEO and founder. Carl's face drained of color. Emma gasped. The other employees stared, their mouths slightly open. Customers whispered, realizing what was happening. Richard let the silence hang for a moment. Then, in a voice as cold as steel, he said, "I own Walker's Burgers, and I just watched you humiliate your own employee in front of customers." Carl took a step back, his confidence crumbling. "Sir, I didn't know." "That shouldn't matter," Richard cut him off. "You don't treat people with respect based on who's watching. You treat them with respect because it's the right thing to do." The entire restaurant was silent. Emma looked at Richard, her eyes filling with something new. Not fear, hope. And Carl, he was about to realize just how badly he had messed up. Carl staggered back as Richard's words hung in the air. The whispers in the restaurant grew louder. Employees exchanged stunned glances. Customers sat frozen in shock. And Emma, the young woman who had just been humiliated, stood in stunned silence. The arrogant manager who had spent years mistreating employees had just realized the biggest mistake of his career. "Sir, I didn't know who you were," Carl finally stammered, trying to salvage the situation. Richard's eyes hardened. And that's exactly the problem. The weight of those words hit Carl like a brick. Richard crossed his arms, his piercing gaze locked onto the man who had just made a fool of himself. "You don't respect people. You only respect power. You had no idea I was the CEO when you belittled her. Would you have treated her differently if you knew who I was?" Carl opened his mouth, then shut it. He knew he had no excuse. The room was dead silent. Emma stood behind the counter, her hands gripping the register, barely breathing. This was the first time in months someone had stood up for her. Richard turned to the employees. "How many of you have been treated like this by him?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, hands started to rise. First one, then another, and another, until almost every employee had their hand up. Carl's face drained of color. He took a step back, shaking his head. This is exaggerated. They're lying." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Are they? Because I've been standing here for the past 10 minutes, and I saw everything with my own eyes." Carl stammered, his confidence crumbling. Richard shook his head. "This is not how I built my company. This is not what Walker's Burgers stands for." He turned to Emma. She looked up, unsure, afraid to hope. "Emma," Richard said firmly, "tell me the truth. How long has this been happening?" She swallowed hard, glancing at Carl before hesitantly meeting Richard's eyes. And then, for the first time in a long time, she told the truth. "Since the day I started working here." A murmur ran through the employees. Richard's jaw tightened. "I see," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Then I think it's time for a change." Carl froze. "Wait, what are you saying?" Richard didn't hesitate. "You're fired. Effective immediately." The words echoed through the restaurant. Carl's jaw dropped. He looked around, desperate. "Sir, please. This is my job, my career. You can't just—" "You did this to yourself," Richard said, cutting him off. "For years, you've used your position to intimidate and humiliate employees instead of leading them. That's not management, it's bullying. And I don't tolerate bullies in my company." Security had already been called. 2 men in uniform stepped forward. Carl took a step back. "Sir, please, give me another chance." Richard met his desperate eyes. "I gave you a chance the moment I walked in here, and you wasted it." Carl's shoulders slumped. He had no choice but to follow security out the door. As the doors swung closed behind him, the tension in the room finally broke. And then, something unexpected happened. The employees started clapping, not just one or two, but the entire staff. For the first time in years, they felt free. Richard let out a slow breath, turning to face the young woman who had started it all. Emma, still standing at the counter, looked up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. And then, for the first time since Richard had arrived, she smiled. As the applause slowly faded, the atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted. There was no more fear, no more tension, just relief. For the first time in a long time, the employees of Walker's Burgers felt like they had a voice. Emma, still standing behind the counter, couldn't believe what had just happened. She had spent months feeling like she was nothing, Like no matter how hard she worked, it wouldn't matter. And now, the CEO himself had stood up for her. Her hands were still trembling, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from shock. She looked up at Richard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Richard nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the rest of the employees. He had come here undercover, expecting to find problems. But what he had discovered went far beyond one bad manager. "How many of you have worked here for more than a year?" he asked. A few hands went up. "And how many of you have ever been given a raise or a promotion?" Silence, not a single hand. Richard's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about Carl. This was about the culture that had been allowed to fester here, and it was his responsibility to fix it. He turned back to Emma. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Almost a year." "And in that time, has anyone ever acknowledged how hard you work?" Emma bit her lip, shaking her head. "No, sir." Richard let out a slow breath. "That changes today." Emma blinked. "Sir?" Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to her. "As of this moment, you're no longer a cashier," he announced. "I'm promoting you to shift supervisor." The entire room fell silent. Emma's eyes widened. "What?" Richard smiled slightly. "You've shown resilience, patience, and strength. Even when you were treated unfairly, you kept working. That's the kind of leader I need in my company." Emma felt tears well up again, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from pure, overwhelming gratitude. I don't know what to say," she whispered. Richard gave her an encouraging nod. "Say yes, and help me make sure no one in this restaurant is ever treated the way you were today." Emma swallowed hard, then nodded fiercely. "Yes, sir. I won't let you down." Richard smiled. "I know you won't." The rest of the employees looked at each other in shock. This was the first time any of them had seen the company's CEO truly care about them. One of the cooks, a young man named Derek, stepped forward. "Sir, does this mean things are going to change?" he asked hesitantly. Richard's expression turned serious. "Yes, effective immediately." He turned to the entire staff. "I built Walker's Burgers on the belief that employees should be valued just as much as customers. What I saw today, that's not the company I created." He looked around the room. "But I promise you, starting now, things will be different." For the first time in years, the employees believed it. Emma, still holding the business card that had just changed her life, wiped her eyes and stood a little taller. And Richard? He knew this was just the beginning. As Emma stood there, still gripping the business card that had just changed her life, the reality of the moment slowly sank in. 1 hour ago, she had been at her lowest, humiliated, exhausted, and ready to give up. Now, she had been given a second chance. Richard watched the emotions flicker across her face. He could see the disbelief, the relief, and the quiet determination that was beginning to take root. But he wasn't done yet. He turned to the rest of the employees, his voice strong, clear, and full of authority. "What happened today doesn't just stop with Carl being fired. If we're going to make this company better, it starts right now, with all of you." The employees exchanged glances. Some looked hesitant, others hopeful. Richard continued. "No more employees working in fear, no more mistreatment, no more feeling like you're replaceable." He looked at Emma. "We're going to build a company where people like Emma, people who actually care, are the ones leading, because leadership isn't about barking orders or intimidation. It's about respect." Emma straightened, standing a little taller. The employees listened in complete silence. This wasn't just some rich CEO making promises. This was a man who had just fired their worst manager in front of the entire store. They believed him. Richard turned to the regional manager who had arrived after hearing what had happened. "Starting today, I want every Walker's Burgers location evaluated. I want reports on every manager, how they treat their staff, what the employee turnover rate is, and whether or not they're truly leading the way they should." The regional manager nodded quickly, scribbling notes. Richard then looked at the employees. "If any of you have experienced the kind of treatment Emma has, I want you to report it. And I promise you this, you won't be punished for speaking up." A wave of relief passed through the employees. For the first time, they felt safe. One of the cooks, Derek, hesitantly raised a hand. "Sir, does this mean raises are coming too?" A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. Even Emma smiled a little. Richard chuckled, nodding. "It means everything is about to change, including fair wages, proper benefits, and making sure our best employees, like Emma, get the recognition they deserve." The entire room erupted into cheers. For so long they had felt ignored, mistreated, and unseen. But today, everything was different. As the employees celebrated the new changes, Richard turned back to Emma. "You've been through a lot," he said. "And I know this promotion isn't going to fix everything overnight. But I need people like you in leadership. People who actually care about the people they work with." Emma swallowed hard, nodding. "I won't let you down, sir," she said, her voice stronger than before. Richard smiled. "I know you won't." As Richard walked out of the restaurant, he took a deep breath. He had come here today expecting to find a problem with employee morale, but what he had actually found was a wake-up call. For years, he had focused on expansion, profits, and customer satisfaction, but what he had forgotten was that a company is only as strong as the people who run it. And today, he had been reminded of what truly mattered. Because a business isn't built by investors or fancy marketing. It's built by the people who show up every single day, the ones behind the counter in the kitchen making it all work. And from this moment forward, he would never let them be overlooked again. As Richard stepped out of Walker's Burgers, he took a deep breath. The air felt different now. This wasn't just another restaurant. It was a place where real change had just begun. Inside, employees were still buzzing with excitement, exchanging hopeful glances. For the first time, they felt heard, respected, and valued. And at the heart of it all, Emma. She wasn't the same nervous cashier who had been wiping away tears at the register just an hour ago. She was now a leader, standing beside her coworkers with newfound confidence. She had spent so long being overlooked, dismissed, and belittled. But today, she had finally been seen. Richard looked back at the restaurant one last time. He had walked in expecting to observe. Instead, he had walked out with a mission. Because today wasn't just about firing one bad manager. It was about fixing a broken system. And he was just getting started. Do you think Richard made the right call? Should Carl have been given a second chance, or was firing him the best lesson? Let us know in the comments. If you believe that every worker deserves respect, fair wages, and a safe work environment, hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring real-life stories. Because at the end of the day, a company isn't great because of its name. It's great because of the people who run it. See you in the next inspiring story.